In the name of the one who loves the beloved and love itself. Amen. Please be seated. Well done, all of you, for getting here. I just trust my Apple devices now to get me up on days like this. But you get a chance to practice Christian charity when people that come in as we are finishing the service are surprised that we're done, and just love them, okay? Just love them. My time clock is completely discombobulated. I flew back from Florida yesterday, so I guess I added 3 hours and I took one away, so I'm averaging out at 2. Is that right? I'm not quite sure. I was at the Episcopal Parish Network Conference, and it was a really great conference talking about the challenges that face our church right now, and also a chance to meet with colleagues. And the bit that I also love is walk around the exhibit hall and talk to all the people and look at all the stuff. I like that. But at these conferences, there's often food and drink. There was a CDSP reception I got invited to. There was another reception I got invited to. I had a dinner with some of my colleagues. There's food and drink. But I was really reflecting on the fact that sometimes there's food and drink that isn't food and drink. You know what I'm talking about? Sometimes going to a conference like this, you're fed not just by the food, you're fed by the company and the conversation and the recognition that you're not alone in this world, that there are other people wrestling with some of the same issues you're wrestling with. The drink, you are refreshed by prayer with other people, by time spent with other people, by reminding yourself what the work is that we're called to do in church. And so I was fed and refreshed by those things. There is food and drink in today's gospel that is not food and drink. Food and drink in today's gospel that is not food and drink. And I had one version of a sermon prepared, but in my time-shifted adult brain, I think I might preach a slightly different one. So will you forbear with me for this? I want you to imagine for a moment a little time in the first century. There's a group of Samaritans that have gathered together. They're waiting for the great woman to arrive. She has a reputation for being engaging, interesting, dynamic. Her face is full of light. That's her name, actually. It's probably a nickname that's been given to her, Photini, the one that brings light. They've been waiting for weeks for her to come and arrive, and as she gets there, they all sit down in anticipation because she's going to speak to them about the one who came and spoke to her one day at a well. She sits down and, they all know the story because they've heard it from other people. It's been passed around in the communities that they're in, but they want to hear it from her because she says it with the experience of the moment behind her eyes. So as they sit down, she starts to speak and says, I met a man at a well, and he told me everything I've ever done. Can he possibly be the Messiah? The moment's electric for everybody there. Turns out that this woman, the woman at the well, married 5 times with a 6th man, became one of the greatest evangelists in Samaria in the early days after Jesus' time. By legend in the Orthodox Church, she is called an apostle or equal to the apostles. She was an evangelist, given the name Photini, spoken of as the light bringer. She was a preacher. She brought people to faith because she told that story over and over again. I met a man at a well. He spoke to me. He told me everything I've ever done. Could he possibly be the Messiah? It's a simple message and invited her audience to contemplate what they thought about Jesus and worship. and the difference between Samaritans and Jews, the ancient enmity that existed between those two peoples. It invited people to wonder what the nature of worship was. I think as she went on speaking in her sermon, she would have told them that we had a debate about worship. I think that Jesus perhaps thought that I was going to go silent after he told me that he knew that I'd been married 5 times and was with a 6th guy, but I decided not to let him have that space on his own, and I decided to push back. I said, listen, you seem like you're a prophet, but you've all told us that we can't worship here in Samaria. We've got to go to Jerusalem. But we do worship here. And he sat back and reflected on what I said and didn't end the conversation, didn't shut me down, listened to me and said, listen, yes, the Jews do think that true worship comes from Jerusalem, but there's a bigger story coming. There's a better story. It's a story in which everybody can worship, wherever they are. All are welcomed into the family of God. You, a Samaritan woman, with whatever past, whatever struggles, whatever difficulty you've gone through, are welcome. I, a Jewish man, am welcome. There'll be communities gathering together in the future, and all of them will come from different backgrounds, different experiences, men and women, different racial backgrounds, different sexual identities, genders, different educational backgrounds, and all of them are welcomed into this community of worship. All of them, no matter who they are or what they've done. There's a story that's bigger than our petty arguments, and I'm inviting you into it. I'm really convinced that Photini heard him, internalized that message, and lived it, which is why other lives were transformed by her. I'm fascinated with what Jesus did. He broke all kinds of rules. She was a foreign woman. We talk to each other much more easily in public nowadays, but in Jesus' time, you would not speak to a woman without a male relative present. It's why he asked for her husband partway through the conversation. He was saying, bring your husband so we can carry on having this conversation without creating a taboo situation. But he also knew what was going on the surface, which is why the rest of the story unfolded as it did. He broke rules by speaking to her. Perhaps she was shocked by that, but also felt heard. When she made theological comments herself, he didn't stamp on them. He redirected, he carried the conversation on, he engaged with her with respect as a human being. He loved her. In the middle of that whole conversation, he said, listen, I'd like some water because I'm thirsty. And she said, I'm not meant to give you water because you're a man and you're from another country. And then after a moment, he said, well, if you really knew who I was, you'd ask water from me. Then she says that wonderful little phrase, you haven't got a bucket. How are you going to get the water? The well's really deep. And in their conversation about water, it becomes clear that this new kind of worship he's offering is the water of life itself, the thing that will bring us to new life. This gospel's kind of long, and I invite you to read it again later on today because every part of it is essential. That's why we have the entire thing. After she leaves to go and begin evangelizing, because that's the first thing she does from this encounter, the disciples arrive and they say to Jesus, are you hungry? They don't say, why are you talking to that woman? Because they dare not challenge the rabbi. But they say, are you hungry? And he's like, no, I'm fully fed. And just like the water isn't water, the food isn't food. He has had an electric engagement with this woman. He shared the love of God with her. He's heard about her life. He's understood her. And he's realized that what he's come to offer, the good news he's come to share, is going to change her life. And that's all the nourishment he needs. And I started by saying that people later on would wait to hear with bated breath what Photini was going to say, because that's the tradition in the Orthodox Church. She was a preacher and an evangelist, and I think she kept on telling this simple story, this simple, transforming story. But I hope that she told it in a way that replicated Jesus' manner. And here's where I want to invite you to contemplate how you might engage with people that you talk to about faith. One of the dangers is that we think that we have the right answer and everybody else has the wrong answer, and we're there to just tell them what they're wrong about. We're there to tell them what they've done wrong in their lives. We're there to tell them what's wrong with them as a person. We're there to shame them, perhaps, and then say, oh, but we have the answer. And the trouble with that kind of approach is that it doesn't really feel like good news to most people who hear it. It's not good news. Jesus does something different in his moment of evangelism, and I believe that Photini will have lived that out in her life thereafter. He asks her for something. He recognizes that she has something to give him. He's thirsty and he needs water. He engages her in conversation. He finds out about her. I don't know if Jesus read minds or if he was just deeply observant. I don't know how he figured out that she'd been married many times and that the guy that she was with now wasn't her husband. But I do know that it didn't make him stop engaging with her about theology and prayer. He didn't use a sense of judgment in that conversation. Just accepted her as she was and accepted that she had opinions about prayer that he wanted to understand. Again, in the conversation, she had something to offer and he had something to offer. And he invited them to go deeper, to think about this new universal kind of prayer that everybody would be able to engage with, that transcended gender and ethnicity and background and even divorce, remarriage, sexuality, gender, all of these things. He invited her to go deeper, and in that engagement, she was transformed. So I could use this conversation as a way to say, here's how we're going to do evangelism at Trinity Cathedral, but that's not really the programmatic place that I'm going to right now. I just want to say a couple of things to you about the kinds of conversations you might have with people in your life. Don't enter into the conversation thinking I have all the answers and they don't. Enter into a conversation curious about the people that you're talking to. Don't enter into a conversation about faith thinking I'm going to ignore everything they say and just tell them what I believe. But be curious about their beliefs and notice the things in what they say that are life-giving and meaningful. And also remember that what we share with people should sound like good news, and if it doesn't, it probably isn't. So when you share the good news that you've learned about Jesus Christ, talk about how it's brought you life, transformed you, how you found forgiveness and love in a community that really embraces you, how everybody's welcome, everybody can worship, everyone can connect with God, everyone can be gathered into the community of God's love. That sounds like good news. Share it with them. And give thanks for Photini and her witness. I'm not joking, the Orthodox Church has a name day for her. It's Photini. She is recognized as equal to the apostles. She's one of the great evangelists of the early church. And it all flowed from this story today. So go home and read it and learn the lessons of conversation about spirituality that leads to conversion from it. Thank you for listening. Amen.